Linda had always considered herself a woman of patience and composure. At 58, she'd weathered life's storms gracefully, raising two children alone after her husband's unexpected passing 15 years ago. Her modest home was meticulously tidy, filled with photographs of grandchildren and the gentle aroma of freshly baked bread. Linda knew her worth, but nothing had prepared her for the disdainful gaze of Deborah, her new mother-in-law to be. It all started when her son, Ethan, introduced her to Julia. Julia was a soft-spoken woman in her early 30s, recently divorced, and mother to a delightful 4-year-old named Oliver. Linda warmed to Julia instantly. She admired Julia's resilience and saw in her eyes the quiet determination of someone who had endured more hardships than she'd ever admit. Yet Linda sensed Julia was hiding a sadness, a familiar sadness Linda recognized all too well. However, the complications began with Julia's mother-in-law from her first marriage, Deborah Hamilton. Deborah was a proud, severe-looking woman in her 60s, elegant in appearance, but cold as polished marble. Her family had significant wealth and influence within the small town they all shared. Deborah's son, Richard, Julia's ex-husband, had remarried quickly after their divorce, but Deborah never relinquished control over Julia's life. She seemed determined to see Julia remain isolated, alone, and eternally subservient. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Linda invited Ethan and Julia over for tea. They were laughing quietly around the small kitchen table, Oliver coloring happily in the corner, when there was a sharp knock at the door. Linda's heart sank slightly as Deborah strode uninvited into the room, a bottle of expensive Chardonnay clutched in one impeccably manicured hand. "Ah, Julia," Deborah said coolly, her gaze brushing dismissively over Linda. "I see you've already found someone to fill Richard's shoes. My son certainly moved on fast. Why shouldn't you?" Julia flushed bright red, the humiliation clearly etched on her face. Linda's eyes narrowed, but she held her peace for Ethan's sake. She wanted desperately to defend Julia, to stand up to this haughty woman, but years of quiet restraint kept her silent. Deborah's eyes glittered triumphantly, as though she'd scored a decisive victory. The visit was brief but impactful, leaving Julia visibly shaken. Once Deborah left, Julia apologized repeatedly for the intrusion, her voice trembling as she gathered Oliver and hurriedly prepared to leave. As Linda watched Julia depart, a burning resentment took root inside her. Resentment against Deborah, against the harsh unfairness that women like Julia face daily, and against herself for remaining silent when she ought to have spoken. That evening, Linda could not shake Deborah's cold, judgmental words from her mind. "She's not good enough for our family." The bitterness behind those words hung heavy in the air, a silent accusation that had wounded Julia deeply. Linda knew she couldn't let this injustice persist. She knew, instinctively, that Deborah's hold on Julia was sinister and dangerous, something deeply rooted in control, rather than genuine concern for family honor. As she lay awake, Linda vowed that the next time Deborah Hamilton tried to impose her twisted will, she'd find herself facing a different woman altogether, one she'd gravely underestimated. Yet, even Linda did not know just how quickly that opportunity would present itself, or how fiercely the coming storm would challenge them all. Days passed, and Deborah's harsh words still haunted Linda. She found herself unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her cozy, familiar life. Determined to understand the source of Deborah's hostility, Linda began subtly asking around town, carefully piecing together fragments of Julia's past marriage and Deborah's enigmatic persona. Julia's first marriage to Richard had once seemed picture-perfect, at least from the outside. Richard was charming, successful, and Deborah's clear favorite, a golden child who could do no wrong. Yet, beneath the polished surface, Linda discovered whispers of Richard's controlling tendencies and Deborah's obsessive interference in their marriage. Neighbors hinted cautiously about arguments overheard through open windows and tense silences at community gatherings. Linda learned more unsettling truths. Julia's divorce had not merely ended her marriage, it had unleashed Deborah's persistent wrath. Deborah used her influence to subtly ostracize Julia, painting her as unstable and neglectful, determined to isolate her from anyone who might provide support. Even Julia's own family had slowly drifted away, convinced by Deborah's manipulative whispers. The realization shook Linda to her core. Julia had endured emotional torment alone, silently struggling just as Linda herself had many years ago. But the question that remained unanswered was why? What fueled Deborah's relentless hatred? One afternoon, as Linda tended her garden, she was startled by the sudden, uninvited arrival of Deborah once again. Dressed in an elegant white suit, Deborah looked strangely out of place among Linda's modest flower beds. Her presence radiated quiet authority, a chilling reminder of her power. "Linda," Deborah began, her tone icy yet composed, "I thought we should have a little chat, just us women." Linda rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. "About what, Deborah?" "Julia, Ethan, this marriage they're planning." Deborah's eyes narrowed, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Your son seems decent enough, but Julia will ruin him just as she ruined Richard. You must see that." Linda straightened her shoulders, courage rising like fire inside her. "I see no such thing. Julia is kind and strong. If anything, your son—" Deborah raised a hand sharply, cutting Linda off. "Careful, Linda. You're stepping into matters far beyond your comprehension. I won't allow Julia to continue poisoning lives. I'll protect my family by whatever means necessary." Linda felt a chill run down her spine at the implied threat. "Protect your family? Or protect yourself?" Deborah's face darkened briefly before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. "Don't cross me, Linda. I have influence you cannot fathom. Julia learned that the hard way. You do well to keep out of this." With that chilling warning, Deborah turned abruptly, leaving Linda alone with her thoughts spinning in turmoil. Linda felt anger, fear, but most of all clarity. Deborah Hamilton was more dangerous than she'd initially believed. Her cruelty masked something deeper, darker, and far more personal. Linda knew she couldn't fight Deborah's wealth or influence directly, but she understood Julia's pain, her fear, and her loneliness. Linda silently promised herself she would uncover Deborah's secrets, whatever they were, and bring them into the light. Deborah had made her first critical mistake, underestimating Linda's resolve. Linda's quiet inquiries slowly yielded valuable clues. She discreetly visited old acquaintances, subtly steering conversations toward Deborah. In hushed voices, people shared tidbits of gossip. How Deborah had skillfully maneuvered her way into positions of influence within community organizations, always maintaining an immaculate facade. Her husband, Charles Hamilton, was a distant figure, overshadowed by his formidable wife's ambitions. Yet, despite Deborah's apparent strength, neighbors hinted at tension within the Hamilton home. Determined to understand more, Linda approached Margaret, the town librarian and an old school friend. Margaret had known Deborah since childhood and had never succumbed to Deborah's intimidating presence. Over coffee in Margaret's cozy office, Linda carefully broached the subject. "Deborah Hamilton?" Margaret's eyes flashed knowingly over her reading glasses. "She wasn't always so polished, Linda. Her mother raised her alone after a scandal nobody speaks about anymore. Deborah vowed she'd never suffer the humiliation her mother did." Linda leaned in curiously. "Scandal?" Margaret lowered her voice, eyes darting to the door. "Deborah's father abandoned them when she was just 10, running off with a woman who, strangely enough, was strikingly similar to Julia. fragile, kind-hearted, and vulnerable. Deborah blamed her mother's heartbreak entirely on women she saw as weak. Women like Julia, unfortunately. This revelation resonated deeply within Linda. Deborah's hostility wasn't simply snobbery. It stemmed from childhood trauma she never overcame, turning her bitterness outward. Linda now understood Deborah's aggression. Julia unwittingly represented everything Deborah despised, triggering deep-seated fears and resentments Deborah had nurtured for decades. Later that evening, Linda invited Julia over under the pretext of baking cookies. As they measured ingredients together, Linda gently revealed what she'd learned. Julia's hands trembled slightly, absorbing the truth. "All this time," Julia whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought it was me. I thought I'd failed somehow." Linda squeezed Julia's shoulder reassuringly. "You didn't fail, Julia. Deborah is fighting demons from her past and taking them out on you." Julia managed a small, grateful smile, leaning into Linda's comforting presence. It was clear their bond had strengthened significantly. Meanwhile, Ethan remained quietly conflicted, clearly aware something was wrong, yet reluctant to confront Deborah openly. Linda worried about her son's passivity, whether it stemmed from genuine ignorance or fear of Deborah's power. She knew she'd soon need Ethan to stand firmly by Julia's side, or risk Deborah pulling him away. In her refined mansion, Deborah sat alone, swirling a glass of wine thoughtfully. The mask of control briefly slipped, revealing exhaustion. She hadn't anticipated Linda's quiet tenacity or Julia's new ally. For the first time, Deborah felt genuine unease, a threat to the empire she'd meticulously crafted. At a community charity gala, tensions simmered beneath smiles and pleasantries. Linda had never been comfortable at these events, yet tonight she attended deliberately, knowing Deborah would be present. Ethan escorted Julia, but his anxious glances revealed his inner turmoil. Deborah, poised as always, gracefully circulated through the crowd, her cold elegance masking unease. Spotting Charles Hamilton standing alone by the refreshment table, Linda saw an opportunity. Approaching cautiously, she introduced herself with a gentle smile. Charles appeared startled, unused to direct attention, his quiet demeanor overshadowed by his wife's overpowering presence. "You must be Ethan's mother," Charles spoke softly, kindness evident in his eyes. "Deborah mentioned you?" Linda caught the slight hesitation in his voice. "Did she? I suspect it wasn't all good." Charles smiled weakly, eyes drifting briefly toward Deborah. "Deborah is complicated. She has her reasons." "Everyone has reasons," Linda agreed calmly. "But Julia doesn't deserve the suffering your wife inflicts. Perhaps it's time someone intervened." Charles hesitated, conflicted emotions flickering across his face. I wish I could do more. Deborah's hold is strong." Linda understood then how isolated Charles had become. Years of living under Deborah's shadow had broken his spirit. Before she could press further, Deborah appeared swiftly by Charles's side, her eyes narrowing suspiciously at Linda. "Enjoying the gala, Linda?" Deborah asked coolly, gently gripping Charles's arm possessively. Linda maintained eye contact, matching Deborah's calm. Very illuminating. It seems everyone has something they'd prefer remained hidden. Deborah's expression hardened slightly, betraying discomfort. Nearby, Ethan watched the interaction anxiously, clearly struggling internally. Linda noticed his hesitation, sensing the time was rapidly approaching when he would be forced to choose definitively between loyalty to Julia and fear of Deborah. As Linda walked away, she overheard quiet murmurs among guests, curious, skeptical whispers, suggesting Deborah's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack. Deborah herself felt it too. For the first time, she sensed her influence slipping through her fingers like sand. The aftermath of the gala lingered in everyone's thoughts, but Linda knew there was no turning back. Julia, encouraged by Linda's unwavering support, seemed stronger each day, slowly reclaiming confidence Deborah had meticulously stripped away. Linda, however, understood their growing unity wouldn't go unanswered by Deborah. One rainy afternoon, Ethan stopped by Linda's home unexpectedly, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Sitting quietly at the kitchen table, he spoke softly, almost reluctantly. "Mom, I don't know what to do," Ethan admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "Julia needs me to stand up for her, but Deborah, she's capable of anything. She has influence, money, connections. I've never seen someone wield power like her." Linda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Deborah's strength comes from the fear she instills in others. She feeds on silence. When you stand by Julia openly, you weaken Deborah's greatest weapon." Ethan looked at his mother earnestly, desperate for guidance. But how? Deborah's already started whispering to Julia's friends again, making them doubt her stability, questioning her fitness as a mother. She's ruthless. Linda's heart tightened at Deborah's vicious tactics. She knew a new battle had begun. "We'll face this together, Ethan, but Julia needs your courage now. The community will follow your lead." Meanwhile, across town in the Hamilton mansion, Deborah strategized coldly. Her pride wounded by Linda's growing defiance and Charles's noticeable discomfort, she resolved to remind them all who truly controlled their small world. Deborah knew Linda had spoken to Charles at the gala. She'd sensed something shift in him since that evening. When Charles returned home that night, Deborah met him in the foyer, her expression chillingly calm. "Charles," she began smoothly, adjusting his tie with practiced authority, "Linda is becoming troublesome. She's meddling in family matters that don't concern her. I expect you to put a stop to it." Charles hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers momentarily. He swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Maybe it's time we let go, Deborah. Julia's moved on. Ethan seems like a decent man. Why continue this?" Deborah's eyes flashed dangerously. "I built our life, Charles. I will not allow a woman like Julia, or her meddling future mother-in-law, to tear it down. Remember who you are without me? Nothing." Her words stung deeply, but Charles remained silent, torn between submission and rebellion. He recognized something new within himself, a small spark ignited by Linda's quiet strength. Yet fear lingered. Breaking free from Deborah's grip seemed impossibly daunting. That evening, Deborah initiated her counterattack. Using her influential network, she spread discreet but damaging rumors about Julia, questioning her mental health and parenting abilities. Within hours, the community buzzed with uncertainty, threatening to isolate Julia once more. Julia called Linda late that night, shaken and terrified. "Deborah's trying to destroy me again," Julia whispered, desperation coloring her voice. Linda reassured her firmly, her determination unwavering. "We expected this. It's Deborah's last desperate attempt to regain control. Hold strong, Julia. We're prepared this time." Linda knew they'd reached a turning point. Deborah had revealed her weakness in resorting to such overt cruelty. Now was the moment to strike back, but they needed Ethan and Charles to finally find their voices and openly defy Deborah's tyranny. Linda wasted no time after Deborah's rumors began spreading. Knowing every minute counted, she visited Margaret at the library again. Margaret's respected position and discreet authority made her an influential ally. Over steaming tea, Linda quietly explained Deborah's malicious attempts to undermine Julia. "Deborah crossed a line." "Margaret," Linda said, her voice steady with restrained anger. "This isn't about pride anymore. It's cruel and destructive." Margaret nodded solemnly, having witnessed Deborah's ruthlessness before. "People trust Deborah because they're afraid to oppose her. But truth still holds power, Linda. Perhaps it's time we gather allies willing to speak openly. Within days, Linda and Margaret carefully approached influential community members, sharing Julia's true character. Devoted mother, resilient survivor of abuse, and gentle partner to Ethan. Slowly, Deborah's whispers began losing their grip as neighbors who'd known Julia privately started speaking positively again. Meanwhile, Ethan faced an internal battle. Deborah's retaliation against Julia terrified him, but Linda's words echoed constantly. Silence empowered Deborah. After sleepless nights filled with anxiety, he finally decided. Gathering courage, Ethan posted a public message online, openly supporting Julia and denouncing the vicious gossip as false. My fiancée, Julia, is kind, loving, and a wonderful mother. The rumors circulating about her mental health are cruel fabrications aimed to hurt and divide us. I will stand by her side against this injustice, Ethan declared publicly. Immediately drawing support from friends and acquaintances, relieved someone finally opposed Deborah openly. News of Ethan's public stance quickly spread, shaking Deborah's carefully built facade of control. Angered and startled, Deborah confronted Charles that evening, demanding his intervention. You need to speak to Ethan immediately, Deborah hissed, barely containing her fury. He's publicly humiliated me. Us. This foolishness stops now. Charles, emboldened by recent events, shook his head slowly. No, Deborah, this has gone too far. Ethan's right, and you know it. Julia isn't the problem here. You are. Deborah's face paled with shock. Charles had never dared oppose her before. She recognized then the magnitude of her predicament. The fortress she'd built through fear and control was rapidly collapsing, brick by brick. Julia, meanwhile, felt an unfamiliar strength blossoming within her, fueled by Ethan's unwavering support, Linda's courage, and the growing backing of a community no longer willing to tolerate Deborah's cruelty. Desperate to reclaim control, Deborah planned one final attempt. She approached Julia directly at Oliver's preschool, hoping to intimidate her publicly. Deborah's voice, though quiet, carried unmistakable venom. You think you've won, Julia? Deborah hissed softly, eyes narrowed in contempt. You've turned Ethan and even Charles against me, but I'm still here. One mistake, just one, and they'll all see you as I do. But Julia surprised Deborah by standing taller, meeting her gaze calmly, confidently. You've spent years breaking me down. I used to fear you, but not anymore. Everyone sees who you truly are now. Deborah faltered briefly, shocked by Julia's newfound strength. Nearby, several parents watched cautiously, murmuring among themselves. Deborah quickly sensed the eyes upon her, realizing she had publicly lost control of her carefully managed image. Humiliated, she retreated swiftly, determined to strike back more fiercely, even if it cost her everything. Enraged by public humiliation, Deborah made a desperate move. Using her fading connections, she reported Julia anonymously to Child Protective Services, alleging neglect and emotional instability. The investigation deeply upset Julia, who feared losing Oliver. However, Linda quickly stepped in, rallying Margaret and other respected community members who testified confidently in Julia's favor. Ethan stood solidly by Julia's side, vowing publicly that Deborah's malicious attempts would fail. When authorities cleared Julia of wrongdoing, suspicion immediately turned toward Deborah, whose final grasp at power had backfired disastrously. As news of Julia's vindication spread through the town, outrage rapidly turned toward Deborah. People who once feared her began openly voicing their disgust at her ruthless tactics, their whispers becoming a unified outcry. Deborah, accustomed to respect born of fear, was now met everywhere with silence and disdainful glances. A bitter reversal she struggled to accept. Linda sensed the opportunity clearly, knowing the community had finally reached a breaking point. Determined, she carefully approached Charles once more, urging him to openly denounce Deborah's cruelty. Charles hesitated initially, still carrying decades of fear and submission, but something within him had changed irrevocably after witnessing Deborah's heartless attempt to separate Julia from Oliver. "I've stood silently for too long," Charles finally admitted to Linda, exhaustion evident in his gentle voice. "Deborah's fear controls everyone, but most of all, it controlled me." Linda placed a comforting hand on Charles's arm. "You're stronger than you realize, Charles. Your voice matters. It's time Deborah understands she can't silence everyone." That evening, during a widely attended town council meeting, Charles made an unexpected appearance. Deborah, startled by his presence, watched nervously from her usual seat of influence. The hall fell silent when Charles rose unsteadily, clearing his throat with quiet dignity. "My name is Charles Hamilton," he began softly, meeting the surprised eyes of neighbors he'd rarely spoken to before. "Most of you know my wife, Deborah. For years, I've allowed myself to believe that her cruelty was strength, that her control was protection. But recently, I saw her use our power and connections to harm an innocent woman, Julia, who has only tried to rebuild her life. Deborah's actions, especially falsely reporting Julia, are beyond forgiveness. Tonight, I'm publicly stating my support for Julia, Ethan, and Linda. Deborah's reign of fear in this community must end." As Charles sat down, the hall erupted into supportive applause, leaving Deborah utterly stunned. The betrayal, she felt, was absolute, realizing that Charles's defection permanently shattered her image of invulnerability. Tears of anger and humiliation filled her eyes as she fled the council chambers, her influence forever diminished. Linda watched Deborah go, knowing her moment had arrived. Deborah's final defeat lay in fully exposing the truth behind all her manipulations. Linda prepared herself to deliver the final blow, confident that justice was finally within reach. After Charles's public rebuke at the town meeting, Deborah became a shadow of her former self. Abandoned by her husband and shunned by the community she once dominated, she was forced to confront her own solitude. Linda, knowing the final battle was near, prepared meticulously, gathering evidence of Deborah's years of manipulative schemes. One cool autumn evening, Linda invited Deborah to her home, alone. Deborah arrived cautiously, her previous arrogance replaced by wary defensiveness. Linda's kitchen was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and tea, creating a deceptively peaceful setting for their final confrontation. "You've ruined my life, Linda," Deborah spoke first, her voice trembling with resentment. "You turned Charles, Ethan, everyone against me." Linda shook her head calmly. "No, Deborah, you did that yourself. I simply exposed the truth you kept hidden." Deborah's eyes flashed bitterly. "You think you know everything? You know nothing about the humiliation, the abandonment that shaped me." Linda leaned forward, compassion surprisingly evident. "I understand pain, Deborah, but pain doesn't justify cruelty. For decades, you've hurt others to mask your own wounds. It ends now." Deborah scoffed weakly, trying to maintain composure. "You can't end it. This town needs me." "No, Deborah, the town has moved past you." Linda produced a folder filled with documents, emails, and testimonies, evidence she'd quietly gathered. "Everything you've done, your sabotage of Julia's custody case, financial manipulations, even past threats toward those who opposed you, is documented here. It's over." Deborah paled, staring at the folder as her hands trembled uncontrollably. Her carefully crafted image was gone, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Linda spoke again, her voice firm yet compassionate. "You have two choices now: face the community and accept responsibility, or quietly leave this town forever. Either way, your manipulation stops here. Deborah stood abruptly, breathing unevenly as the truth sank in. Finally broken, she nodded once, acknowledging her defeat without words. Turning silently, Deborah left Linda's house, disappearing into the fading evening light. In the weeks that followed, Deborah quietly relocated, leaving behind only whispers of the woman who once wielded such fearsome power. The town, relieved and unified, celebrated Julia and Ethan's wedding joyfully, embracing them fully. Charles, freed from years of oppressive silence, discovered his own strength and purpose, finding fulfillment through community involvement and friendship. Julia stood radiant beside Ethan, transformed by the unwavering support of Linda, whose quiet strength had changed the course of their lives forever. As Linda watched them exchange vows, she knew the trials they'd faced had forged bonds of trust and resilience that nothing could break. Later that evening, Ethan approached Linda, gratitude clear in his eyes. "Mom, I never realized how strong you truly are. How much we all needed your courage." Linda smiled warmly, embracing him. "We all found strength, Ethan. Deborah underestimated what happens when people refuse to be silenced." In the end, Linda knew justice hadn't come from vengeance or anger, but from courage, unity, and compassion. Her quiet determination had revealed not only Deborah's downfall, but the true strength within them all.